You're listening to the Sex and Psychology Podcast, the sex ed you never got in school and won't get anywhere else. I am your host, Dr. Justin Lehmiller. I am a social psychologist and research fellow at the Kinsey Institute and author of the book, Tell Me What You Want, The Science of Sexual Desire and How It Can Help You Improve Your Sex Life. When people think about great sex, they often picture the same thing, that peak moment, the fireworks, the orgasm. But what if we stopped thinking about pleasure as a single moment? What if we instead thought about pleasure as a cycle, one that starts long before you touch someone and continues long after the experience ends? In today's episode, we're talking about how to have more pleasurable sex by understanding how pleasure actually works in the brain. We'll explore the 3 phases of the pleasure cycle, which include wanting, liking, and learning, and why cultivating each of them can transform not just your sex life, but your relationship to desire itself. We'll also discuss why all too often, low desire in relationships doesn't stem from lost attraction to our partner, but lost connection to ourselves. And when you're disconnected from your own body, it's very hard to access pleasure. I am joined once again by Dr. Nicole McNichols, an associate teaching professor in the Department of Psychology at the University of Washington. Nicole's course, The Diversity of Human Sexuality, is the largest and most popular course in the university's history, with 4,000 enrolled students each year. Nicole is the author of the new book, You Could Be Having Better Sex. This is going to be another fascinating conversation that you won't want to miss. Stick around and we're going to jump in right after the break. If you love the science of sex as much as I do, consider becoming a friend of the Kinsey Institute at Indiana University. The Kinsey Institute is the world's premier research organization on sex and relationships, and you can help them continue the legacy of Dr. Alfred Kinsey, whose pioneering research changed everything we think we know about sex. Visit kinseyinstitute.org to make an impact. Your donations can help support ongoing research projects on critical topics. You can also show your support by following Kinsey Institute on Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram. Thank you for supporting sex science. Okay, Nicole, let's talk about what people need to know when it comes to having more and better sex in their relationships. So first up, when sex dwindles in a long-term relationship, people often blame it on a change in chemistry. We lost the spark, or we're just not sexually compatible anymore. But you argue that what's often fading isn't attraction to one's partner, but the connection that you have to yourself. You're not feeling embodied, alive, or present anymore when it comes to sex. So can you help us to understand that distinction and why losing touch with your own erotic self is often a bigger driver of low desire than losing attraction to your partner?
Exactly. Well, I know that, like me, you come from a social psychology background. And one of the things that we learn about is this fundamental attribution error, which is, the fact that we tend to be more likely to blame the situation, which in this place would be our relationship or our partner, for behavior because it's just easier to see, right? It's right in front of us. It seems like the obvious answer, as opposed to knowing that it might come from ourselves, right? And we tend to do that when it's behavior about ourselves. We're more likely to blame the situation. Whereas when we're viewing other people who are behaving in a certain way, we're like, oh, it has to do with you, not your situation. So it's sort of this interesting paradox. So if you look at that, right, we have to remember that because, again, of all these messages that we see in the media, first of all, we're expecting that hot sex looks like always wanting to rip off the clothes of your partner the second they walk in the room, which is not at all a necessary ingredient for really pleasurable sex. But a lot of times, right, our lack of desire, it's not about a lack of passion. It's about feeling tapped out in a society that just has so much overemphasis on productivity, on working, on this puritanical grind, that pleasure is superfluous, that sex is a treat, right? That it's something that you have to get lucky for. And, as a result, things like the shame that come from this culture that we live in, things like exhaustion, right? I often tell people a great place to start with improving your sex life is simply get more sleep, which might be the most boring sex advice you've ever heard, but is remarkably effective. Right?
It totally is.
Because of everything that we're struggling with. And so, a lot of times it depends on the particular cognitive load that's weighing you down in your life, but that essentially what I'm trying to do is allow people to have the self-agency to say, okay, this isn't just about my partner and my relationship. What's going on with me? How have I lost my vitality? How have I lost my ability to feel hot, right? To have that sense of feeling turned on by yourself before you can actually feel turned on by a partner, because I think that we don't give nearly enough emphasis to how important that is.
Yeah. And it doesn't mean that you failed. Like, I think that this just happens for a lot of people because life gets busy and we just sort of become disconnected from ourselves. And especially in the context of relationships where you have children and your parents and you're highly stressed, your pleasure, your desire isn't as much of a priority as it was in the past. And so we can kind of easily lose touch with that for other reasons. Again, it doesn't mean that you did something wrong, that you failed, but it just means we need to get back in touch with ourselves if we want desire to come back. Because really knowing yourself sexually, authentically, like what turns you on, what brings you pleasure, what stokes your desire is really the key to having more and better sex in a long-term relationship.
Exactly. You need to be able to do your homework, so to speak, in terms of understanding what are the obstacles getting in your way, as well as what are your own turn-ons. Because again, we tend to think that having a hot, better sex life is about adding things, right? Whether it's handcuffs or lingerie or blindfold, which I have a whole chapter on those in my book, right? Absolutely.
I thought you were going to say I have a whole closet or a whole drawer of those things.
Oh, that too. Absolutely. Those things can be fabulous, right? They can add. But a lot of times, what's going to have a bigger impact on our feeling of desire and our sex life are the things that we can take away, not the things we need to add, but the things that we need to kind of clear out our own mental erotic space so that desire can bloom and have enough oxygen to start to thrive. Because if we are just weighed down by shame and stigma and feeling tapped out and feeling like we're, being pulled in a million different directions, then of course we're not going to feel sexy, right? And now what I'm not saying, right, is that you can't have any stress in your life if you're going to enjoy sex, right? That's certainly not the advice I want to give. It's not realistic advice. But you do need to be doing things that, sex, yes, but other things that bring you feelings of pleasure, right? I mean, we know that overall pleasure, there's so much data from the happiness research showing how it just builds feelings of ego resiliency. It causes a broadening effect. You turn outwards, you seek more social support, right? In other words, doing things that involve, yes, taking a nap, getting in the bath, closing your laptop earlier at night, not saying yes to everyone, controlling the level that you're people pleasing. That might not sound as exciting as trying out, XYZ new sex move, but it's fundamental if we want to be having better sex. And so I just think we need to draw more attention to it, even if it isn't the most dramatic sex advice.
Yeah. And, sometimes the best sex advice isn't about, oh, here's this spicy new technique that you can try. Sometimes it is more fundamental. And sometimes the sex advice doesn't sound that sexy, but it can actually have a much bigger effect in terms of helping you to experience more pleasure. Now, speaking of pleasure, another really important point you make in the book is by saying that pleasure isn't a single sensation, or it isn't just having a climax or orgasm. Rather, pleasure is a cycle that has 3 phases: wanting, liking, and learning. So can you walk us through the pleasure cycle? Like for right now, you can just give us kind of the brief overview of, what are these 3 different phases? What do they mean? And then we'll talk individually about each one and kind of how to optimize pleasure.
Great. Yes. So the pleasure cycle has 3 phases. The wanting stage, right? And so I kind of compare this to imagine your favorite food, right? For me, it's chocolate chip cookies. So when I'm eating a chocolate chip cookie, I'm not just deriving pleasure from the minute that I bite into it and it hits my taste buds, right? There's the anticipation of it, which is inherently pleasurable itself. This is when dopamine peaks and really kind of activates that seeking of a reward, right? It's kind of like the night before Christmas being so exciting. Then we get to the liking stage. That's actually when I'm eating the cookie. The chocolate chips are bursting in my mouth. It's gooey, it's soft, warm, all, delicious. Sounds a lot like sex now that I'm actually saying it.
Food analogies
Food
often
analogies
do.
often do. And then there's the learning stage, right? Afterwards, where we kind of look back and we think, wow, God, that cookie was delicious. It had the perfect ratio of chocolate chips. Maybe next time I want to experiment with even slightly larger chocolate chips. And you sort of reflect on it, right? It's sort of that sexual afterglow, so to speak, but in my example for a chocolate chip cookie. And so the idea is that if we really want to maximize our access to pleasure, we need to be paying attention to each of its three distinct phases and learning how we can optimize each one.
Yeah. And I like this way of thinking about pleasure. And going back to something earlier you said about dopamine during the wanting phase, I think for a lot of people, this is going to sound counterintuitive that dopamine peaks before we actually get what we want. It doesn't peak in response to actually receiving the reward. And so many people have this very oversimplified, inaccurate view of how dopamine works because we hear about it in the media all the time where people will say, oh, well, we like this thing because it floods the brain with dopamine. And, it makes it sound like when we get our reward that we're just getting this big burst of dopamine. And no, it's actually dopamine is rising in anticipation of the reward, right? And so I think that tells us something really crucial about pleasure, which is that the longing, the buildup, the anticipation, they're not just like nice extras. They're actually like really central to pleasure and desire.
Exactly. Exactly. And I think that that's why, for example, some of these hit shows that we're seeing on TV, like Heated Rivalry, it's about longing and desire and wanting and just that anticipation phase, right? That I think is really resonating with people. And, even if you look at shows like The Summer I Turned Pretty, which was another huge hit, right? A much more optimistic, more sort of wholesome view of sex and love, perhaps. But still, I think what people really gravitated toward was this longing and wanting. So to your point, it really shows how those aspects are within themselves enjoyable and shouldn't be dismissed and need to be cultivated.
Well, since you brought up Heated Rivalry, I think we have to talk about it for a minute.
Yay! Obsessed.
All right. So I had heard so much about that show before watching it, and everybody made it sound like it was essentially just softcore porn.
Uh-huh.
And so, I went into it thinking like this is really a show that's fundamentally about sex. And the thing that was most surprising to me about it was how little sex there actually is. And it is much more to your point about the anticipation, the buildup, the longing, and so forth. And so for me personally, like as a sex researcher, when I'm watching and consuming media, I tend not to actually watch shows that are about sex because it feels like work.
Me too.
But so I was just kind of surprised. I'm like, oh, there's not as much sex in here as I thought there was going to be. But
Oh God, we could have our own episode on Heated Rivalry. That show is so interesting and so wonderful for so many reasons.
Yeah. And it comes at an interesting point in time in terms of, what's happening more broadly with the LGBTQ community right now. And here's this show that's, specifically about gay characters in the closet who are having this romance. And it's this cultural phenomenon that everybody is watching and talking about.
Exactly. And what I also love is that the primary viewership is straight women, right? So, which is not surprising because, first of all, we know from your research that gender bending and homoeroticism are, it's one of the most popular sexual fantasies. So it completely makes sense that, we get turned on all the time by things that are not, what we would necessarily label as our own sexual orientation identity. I actually talk a lot about this in my book, in my chapter on sexuality. But, the other thing that's really interesting about it is that you're watching, again, back to these power differentials. If you look at these two hockey players who are longing for each other and having a lot of hot sex, they're both successful. They're both hot. They're both rich. They're both star hockey players. I think women are so used to watching sex scenes between people where one person has so much more power than the other one, usually the man than the woman. And usually it's, the woman who's desiring everything and has this longing. And we see the men kind of emotionally closed off, sort of a little bit like in 50 Shades of Grey, right? That's the narrative we're used to seeing. I think women love seeing men who are longing for each other and wanting and showing that desire. So I kind of like that aspect of it too.
Yeah, I'll say one more thing about that show, which
okay.
is that after I watched the first episode, I went into it not knowing anything other than just like having seen a whole bunch of stuff about it on social media. After I watched that episode, I'm like, this really feels like it was a romance novel written by a woman who really likes gay porn. And I went and looked up afterwards and I'm like, oh, that's exactly what it was.
Oh, that's so funny.
Mm-hmm. So lots of ways to think about and analyze that show. But anyway. So let's get back to pleasures.
Back to how to have better sex, right?
Yes. As I love to say on this show, masturbation isn't anything to be ashamed of, and pleasure doesn't need to look one way. Our sponsor, Erica Lust, is here to reimagine how we see and feel pleasure. Erica Lust is an award-winning filmmaker and the force behind the world's leading platform for ethical, cinematic adult films. With Erica Lust, you get more than porn. You get real intimacy, real orgasms, real stories. Every film is made with consent, craft, and care, from casting to climax. Whether you're watching solo or with a partner, Erica Lust's work celebrates what actually turns people on, with equal pleasure for everyone involved. And right now, Erica Lust is offering our listeners 45% off your subscription when you enter the code Justin at ericalust.com. That's Erica Lust with a K. Check the show notes for the link or visit ericalust.com and use promo code Justin. So we talked about, wanting as being the first part of pleasure. So how do we optimize that stage of things?
Well, again, it kind of goes back to the, getting sleep, exercising, right? Making sure that you are finding time to unwind. But it's also about, I often give couples the advice to, really lean into this level of communication that happens, again, not while you're having sex, but before, right? So sometimes I just say to people, I want you to sit down with each other and just talk about what's the best sex we've ever had, right? And maybe it means both people individually writing a story that, is about that best sex that they've ever had and then sharing it with each other. But I think, to the extent that we can build desire through focusing on, what's working, what really makes us feel turned on, what do we want more of, how can we use a sense of our own sexual curiosity to build on that and lean into what's working, that is going to help to build desire for the actual sex itself. So I think that that's really just key to being able to get in that place where you're, thinking about like, okay, what's amazing here and what can we really build on? And asking each other questions like, what's your favorite way to initiate? Or what helps you to get in the mood? Or what time of day do you best like to have sex? Or, and we can get into things like novelty and all of those different aspects later, but it's just about sort of sitting down and cultivating that wanting phase, because it absolutely can be done and there should be attention given to it.
If you want to experience pleasure, you have to first
want it.
Well, you have to have the want for it, right?
Yeah, exactly.
So let's move on to the liking phase, right? Now, you talk in your book about how liking really depends very heavily on things like presence and novelty. And so habituation and sexual routines and performance anxiety are all things that can really, over time, kill sexual pleasure. So talk to us a little bit about why getting in this performance mindset for sex can undermine our ability to experience pleasure, and why, when we're not fully present during sex, it's hard to feel pleasure too.
One of my favorite studies that I love talking to my students about is from Masters and Johnson, right? Who brought subjects into a lab, hooked up all sorts of sensors to them, watched them have sex, studied everything about the sexual experience. And one thing they found is that this habit of almost watching yourself from a third party perspective, right? Which they called spectatoring, to the point where you're judging yourself and comparing yourself to some kind of standard is so common, right? It is something that gets in so many people's ways from being able to enjoy sex. And if you look at this even at like a neurological level, right? If we look at brains that are in fMRI machines and we're looking at the parts of the brain that are lighting up during orgasm, it's, that prefrontal cortex, that whole part of the brain that's responsible for thinking and judging and analyzing, that really needs to quiet so that the nucleus accumbens and the other pleasure centers of the brain can light up, right? In other words, if we're in this frame of mind where we are, judging and constantly making these comparisons, which is what happens when you're having performative sex, then it's not going to be embodied and you're not going to experience pleasure. But, one of the things that we are, really terrible at is predicting exactly what's going to make us happy in general, right? I know Daniel Gilbert at Harvard has a whole area of research on this idea of affective forecasting. We're terrible at predicting exactly what's going to make us feel really good. And the reason for that is the same reason that we're terrible, at just predicting what's going to make us feel good while we're having sex. We tend to compare ourselves to what's happening in the media, to what's happening culturally, to, what we think we should want because we've heard that it's the hot thing that all of our friends are doing. And, I see that a lot with my students. I see that a lot with friends that are millennials, people my age. It's just this tendency to think, okay, well, I think I'm supposed to enjoy that. And so therefore I'm going to do that, right? And if you're having performative sex, again, you're not having sex from a place where you're being guided by what actually feels good in your body, right? You're not using the own cues in your body. You're not using the sexual cues emanating from your partner to guide you. And you're coming out of a place where you can feel the sensations in your body and you're going more into this judgment mode, which is a huge pleasure thief.
Yeah, it's really, really important to learn how to get out of your head and into the moment during sex and to stop just going through the motions with it and doing what you think you're supposed to be doing as opposed to what actually brings you pleasure.
Yeah. I mean, one of the hottest sex tips for that reason is to practice, what Dr. Lori Brotto developed, the sense of sexual mindfulness, right? Which she developed originally as a therapy for women who are struggling with various types of sexual disorders, but is actually also an incredible tool for just maximizing the pleasure you're bringing from sex. Because with sexual mindfulness, right, which is literally what it sounds like. It's a practice of mindfulness, but brought into your sexual life. You're focusing again on, your breath. You're coming back to those sensations in your body. You might notice judgments that come into your head, like, did I turn the coffee maker off? Or, oh God, is that the cat puking on the floor right now? Or do my thighs look flabby from this angle, which is a common issue that a lot of women with body image issues might have. But if you can bring, again, your attention back to what you're feeling, that sense of mindfulness, notice those thoughts, but also let them go away, let them flow through and out of your head. That mindfulness is the exact antidote that we need to this push that we're all experiencing to have performative sex.
Yeah, and that's also why you lock the cat in the other bedroom before you have sex, right? So the final part of this is the learning phase, where you're reflecting on what worked, what didn't, and what you want more of. And arguably, it's the most neglected part of the pleasure cycle, but you argue that it's really crucial. And it goes back to what you were just saying about how people are terrible at predicting what's going to make them feel happy. So why is it really important to reflect on our previous experiences, and how does that contribute to better sex over time?
Well, again, it goes back to counteracting our tendency to be so reliant on cultural messages about what we want. And so as Daniel Gilbert talks about, the best way to know what's going to make you happy is to look at your actual experience and think, well, how was I feeling in the moment that I was having that exact experience? And this is where it's really helpful to have, a sexual growth mindset and realize that having great sex with a partner is a skill, and you're going to be trying out things that might epically fail. And that's okay. That's part of the learning process. And through experimentation, right? And by the way, right, the research shows us that it only really takes, novelty only really needs to be, you have to try something new about once a month, 12 times a year on average, that leads to these benefits in experiencing better sex, right? Couples who do that report higher levels of sexual satisfaction. That it's again, just, okay, we tried something new. We tried spanking. We tried a sexual position, these different forms of what I call micro novelty, which are, again, don't need to be hanging from the chandeliers. It could be having doggy style standing up, right? It could be having sex at a different time of day, or having sex when you're on vacation, or trying out, a different, dirty talk or sexting during the day. But the idea is that if you're trying these different things and learning into this growth mindset and understanding that sex is a skill set, you can have those experiences. And then during this learning phase, really look back and think, okay, what happened? Like, what felt good? What worked? What should we try more of? Right? Again, using that as your foundation. And the beauty of the learning phase is that it then feeds back into wanting, right? And so this is where, the more we're focused on what brought us pleasure, right? This is one of the reasons why orgasm frequency is actually a predictor of how much, especially women, are going to want sex, right? It's how much are you predicting that actual sex that you're having is going to be pleasurable. If you can learn from the experience about exactly what worked and focus on that, then, right, that's going to feed into wanting, right? Because at the end of the day, as we know, nobody craves bad sex. But if you're leaning into that learning phase to learn, okay, what does pleasurable sex look like for me? You feed back into wanting, right? And that's when you can really start to leverage tools like, I talk about planning intimacy dates, right? Which is, again, looking at the pleasure cycle from the perspective of, okay, we're not going to just schedule sex and expect ourselves to experience pleasure without any of that wanting stage, right? You can't just be expecting to like unload the dishwasher and go to jump into bed together. But, it's like through planning an intimacy date where you're giving time for your nervous systems to connect. Maybe it's, going out to dinner with your partner beforehand and connecting at an emotional level about things that are meaningful to you beyond just what you both did that day, right? Really kind of building out your love maps the way the Gottmans over decades of research have found really is the basis for what connection and desire are built on, right? If you're using that information about what worked from the learning phase and then bringing that back into the very beginning of the cycle, right? And look, in terms of planning an intimacy date, right? The idea is that this doesn't have to be something that's contractual where, if one person gets sick or you get to the moment, you're just not in the mood. Yes, of course, you're allowed to reschedule. But if you're creating that opportunity on a regular basis, right? And, look, research by Amy Muse shows that couples who have sex once a week or more have higher levels of sexual satisfaction on average than couples who have sex less than that. Once a week. That is not an astronomical amount of sex, right? So if you can plan, again, time to say, okay, I want time in my week with my partner to be able to lean into this wanting phase, to cultivate it, to give it the seed to grow, then I'm going to be more likely to be able to be present and enjoy and optimize that next liking phase during sex and give my brain an opportunity to close out all of the other types of distractions that might be there. So I think the pleasure cycle is it's a more holistic way of viewing sex that understands it's not just, two bodies coming together and mashing genitals. It's emotional,
which
sounds so sexy, right? It's an emotional, relational experience. And, the other thing that I just think is really also important for couples to realize here is that when we get back into that wanting phase, right, and you've set your intimacy dates and you're focused on how can I get myself into a place where I experience desire, wanting doesn't have to look the way it does in the movies, right? In other words, you don't need to then feed back into a level of intensity in your wanting phase that is equivalent to what we see in heated rivalry. That is not a necessary precursor, right? Because what we know is that for a lot of people, right, it takes a minute for our bodies to get warmed up, right? You might have more of a responsive desire type than a spontaneous desire type, meaning that look, behavior and beliefs are sort of a two-way street. Sometimes our behavior comes first, meaning we put our body close to our partner, right? We've created our intimacy date. We're feeling emotionally connected. We've calmed our nervous systems down and hopefully synced up with our partner. We've engaged in other forms of maybe non-sexual physical touch and other types of intellectual or spiritual intimacy during this time to really feel connected, right? A lot of times it takes that and then that physical touch of your partner and sort of the slow warming up. Your body might actually begin to show signs of physical arousal that then cause you to have this subjective sense of, oh, this feels good. I'm turned on now. This feels really good, which research shows, right, leads to just as pleasurable sex as when you're starting out really, really thinking that you really want it, right? In other words, there's even new research coming out of Dr. Amy Muse's lab showing that when couples, especially with young children, this study, plan sex, they experience more desire, right? They experience more, not just sexual frequency, but ability to really lean into that wanting stage of their pleasure cycle. So again, we might think that planning an intimacy date just sounds like it's going to rob all the spontaneity and excitement from the sexual experience. But the reality is that it doesn't. It actually can lead to just as pleasurable sex. And we have the long-term daily diary studies of couples that proves it.
Yeah, planning sex doesn't have to take any of the fun out of it. And, that's something that's always struck me as funny because we plan most of the fun things in our lives, like our vacations, our trips to the amusement park, our happy hour visits with friends. We plan so much of our lives, including the things that are fun. And that doesn't make those things any less fun when we actually do them. And in fact, they might be more enjoyable because we built up this excitement before we go, like take a vacation, for example.
Exactly. Leaning into that wanting phase because you've given that dopamine in the beginning a chance to grow. And that's exactly right. We put all these other pleasurable things on our calendars, all these other important things on our calendars. Why don't we make time for intimacy, right? Why don't we prioritize it? Again, it's just this cultural narrative that if it's not just happening, falling from the sky, that it's somehow not enjoyable. And that's just not true. And the other myth I think that couples really fall for often is this idea that distance makes the heart grow fonder. I think what's being sort of mistook there is, this idea that if you are a mystery to your partner, that's going to somehow build desire and make sex hotter. But, the reality is, I think what people are doing is confusing closeness with overfamiliarity, right? In other words, I'm not advocating for pooping in front of your partner. That is probably not the best thing that you can do, or farting in front of your partner, right? I mean, look, it happens, but I would not sit there and let one loose and think that it's probably going to not impact your sex life that you're, trying to have maybe 30 minutes later. But that's about having respect for our partners, not treating them like they're invisible, right? But that's not about preserving mystery. I think that what's really key, is this idea of sort of leaning into each other. Again, it's about knowing each other both at an emotional and psychological level, understanding what are your dreams? What are you interested in? What motivates you? What are you worried about? down to the very details of our day-to-day lives and, what our hobbies are, even if it's something that doesn't really interest you. For example, I got really worked up about a year ago when they discovered that they had found through a microscope some kind of molecules on another planet that indicated there could possibly be life there. And I remember showing this to my husband and being like, this is amazing. And I remember him getting really excited and realizing I think he probably isn't excited at all, but he knows I'm excited. So, and guess what? That made me feel desire, right? I mean, that's the kind of thing, showing interest in what lights us up, that's going to make us feel connected. Because the reality is, I don't think, we assume that the hottest sex of our lives is happening with people who we're just meeting, who we barely know. But the reality is, and, I think especially for a woman, I think a lot of times the best sex of your life happens with someone when they really know your body, right? When you feel a sense of emotional and psychological safety to let go. So again, I just feel like the wanting phase, it doesn't need to be fueled by mystery and distance and separation. I think it's more about leaning in and understanding each other, from an emotional standpoint, and also, from a physical standpoint, like what turns you on, what's been working great in our sex life, and what can we try more of?
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for sharing all of this with us, Nicole. It was really fascinating, and I'm sure people will get a lot of information out of your new book titled You Could Be Having Better Sex. So can you tell my listeners where they can go to learn more about you and get their hands on a copy of your new book?
Yes. So my book is available everywhere books are sold. You can also follow me on Instagram or TikTok at Nicole_the Sex Professor, or visit me on my website at NicoleTheSexProfessor.com.
Great. I'll be sure to include links to all of that in the show notes. Thank you again so much for your time. I really appreciate having you here.
Thanks, Justin. This was wonderful.
Thank you for listening. To keep up with new episodes of this podcast, visit my website, Sex and Psychology, at sexandpsychology.com, or subscribe on your favorite platform, where I hope you'll take a moment to rate and review the show. If you listen on Apple Podcasts, please consider becoming a Sex and Psychology Premium subscriber to enjoy ad-free listening for just $3.99 a month. You can also follow me on social media for daily sex research updates. I'm on Blue Sky and X at Justin Lehmiller, and Instagram at Justin J. Lehmiller. Also, be sure to check out my book, Tell Me What You Want. Thanks again for listening. Until next time.